Leave my property in 5 minutes, or we will remove you. Victoria Reynolds said it calmly, as if the 18 private security guards standing behind her had already settled the matter. I looked at the notice in her hand before I looked at the people surrounding my driveway. I had lived on this property for years, paid the taxes, maintained the buildings, and kept every important document in a locked file cabinet inside my house. I was not going to argue with 18 strangers on my own land. I simply held out my hand and said, "Let me see the order." Victoria smiled and handed me a packet with the HOA letter clipped to the front. The first page looked official until I read the heading carefully. It was not a court order. It was an internal HOA enforcement notice. The document claimed that I was occupying property controlled by the association and that I had refused to comply with the removal request. That was the first thing that bothered me. I knew exactly where my property line was. What I did not know was why the HOA suddenly believed it could send private security to enforce a claim that had never been presented to me before. I turned another page and found a reference to a property transfer scheduled within 72 hours. That was new. Nobody at the HOA had mentioned a transfer when Victoria first contacted me. She had called the matter a compliance issue and insisted that I leave immediately. Now I was looking at paperwork that connected my removal to a transaction I knew nothing about. I asked Victoria who was receiving the property. She avoided the question and told me the HOA board had approved the action. I asked her for the recorded document proving the HOA owned the land. She pointed to the community map attached to the packet. I looked at it and immediately noticed something wrong. The map showed a boundary that did not match the survey I had received when I purchased the property. I did not tell her that yet. I simply took out my phone and photographed every page of the packet. One of the guards watched quietly as I documented the paperwork. Victoria told me that cooperation would make the process easier. I told her I was cooperating. I was asking for the legal basis of what she was demanding. She seemed frustrated that I was not reacting the way she expected. What she did not know was that I had spent years learning to stay calm when everyone around me was waiting for a reaction. I had learned that facts mattered more than volume, and that the first document placed in front of you was not always the document that mattered most. I called my attorney, Michael Brooks, and sent him the photographs. He asked me one question. "Do they have a court order?" I looked at Victoria, then at the 18 guards, and answered, "No." There was a pause on the phone. Then Michael said, "Do not leave your property. I think we need to find out what they are really trying to move." Michael Brooks called me back less than 10 minutes later. "Send me the county parcel number, the deed, and the most recent survey," he said. I walked inside, opened the locked cabinet in my office, and pulled out the folder I had kept since I bought the property. The deed was there. So was the certified survey. The boundary description had never changed. I photographed both documents and sent them to Michael. While he reviewed them, I returned to the driveway. Victoria Reynolds was still standing with the security team, apparently expecting me to reconsider. Instead, I asked her one question. What exactly is supposed to happen within 72 hours? Her expression changed for just a second. Then she said the HOA board had approved a property transition and that my presence could interfere with the process. That word stopped me. Transition. Not violation. Not compliance. Transition. I asked what property was being transferred. She told me the details were confidential. I asked how a confidential transaction could give the HOA authority over land listed in my deed. She did not answer. Instead, she repeated that I needed to cooperate. I went back inside and opened my laptop. Michael had already sent me a message. He had compared my deed with the county parcel database, and everything matched. The property was still recorded in my name. The HOA had no ownership interest listed against it. That should have ended the question, but then Michael sent me something else. It was a county map from several years earlier. The boundary line on that map matched my survey exactly. The HOA map in Victoria's packet showed something completely different. A section of my land had been drawn inside the community boundary. I stared at the two maps side by side. This was not a small labeling error. The difference created an access corridor running across my property toward a neighboring development. I called Michael immediately. He told me not to make accusations until we knew who had submitted the newer map. That was when I realized the HOA's demand was probably not about removing me at all. Someone needed my property to appear available before the transfer deadline. I searched the packet again and found a reference number near the bottom of the last page. Michael recognized it as part of a county planning application. He told me to request the complete file first thing in the morning. There was still another question neither of us could answer. Why had the HOA needed 18 private security guards for a property dispute that could have been handled with a letter? By sunset, the answer was still hidden. But the 72-hour deadline was no longer just a strange line in an HOA notice. It was a countdown, and whatever the HOA planned to transfer was connected to my land. Then Michael called again. His voice was quieter this time. I found the developer's name in the county file, he said. And you are going to want to see the agreement they submitted. Michael Brooks sent me the developer agreement before sunrise. I read it twice before I understood why the HOA had been so determined to get me off my property. The developer was planning a new access route connecting the subdivision to a service road, and the proposed route crossed the exact section of land that my deed identified as private property. The agreement did not say that the developer owned my land. Instead, it described the area as a future access corridor subject to community approval. That wording mattered. Michael explained that the developer could propose a route, and the HOA could support a proposal, but neither could simply turn private property into community property by drawing a line on a map. The 72-hour deadline suddenly made sense. The developer wanted the transaction completed before anyone had time to challenge the paperwork. I asked Michael when the agreement had been submitted. He gave me a date from 3 weeks earlier. That was before Victoria had ever mentioned an HOA violation to me. I opened the original complaint file and compared the dates. The first notice about my property came only 4 days after the developer submitted the revised access plan. That was the first major connection we could prove. The bird complaint had appeared after the access proposal, not before it. I called the county planning office and requested the complete application record. The clerk told me the file could be reviewed in person that afternoon. Michael advised me to bring the original deed and certified survey. I did exactly that. At the county office, I was given a folder containing maps, emails, meeting notes, and planning documents. One map showed the original boundary. Another showed the revised access corridor. The difference was unmistakable. The revised version placed a narrow strip of my property inside the proposed development access area. But there was something else. The revised map carried a notation stating that the boundary information had been supplied for planning purposes and had not been independently verified. That meant the map was not proof of ownership. It was only a planning document. I photographed the notation and sent it to Michael. He replied almost immediately. That may be the document we needed. I kept going through the file. Then I found an email from the developer to an HOA committee member. It said the project could move forward once the existing occupant issue was resolved. My name was not written in the message, but the date matched the first HOA notice. The connection was no longer speculation. Someone had known that my property stood in the proposed corridor, and someone had decided that removing me would make the project easier. I returned home with copies of every relevant page. Victoria was waiting near the community entrance. She asked whether I had reconsidered. I told her I had reviewed the county records instead. She looked at the folder in my hand and asked what I had found. I answered calmly. Enough to know that this was never just an HOA compliance issue. Her expression tightened. Then she said something I had not expected. You have no idea who approved the security contract. That sentence opened the next question. Who had paid 18 guards to stand at my property, and why had the HOA considered that expense necessary in the first place? Victoria's warning stayed with me as I drove home. I did not know who had approved the security contract, but I knew where to look next. Michael Brooks asked me to request the HOA's financial records related to the property dispute, including invoices, board approvals, and any agreement with the security company. I submitted the request that afternoon. The answer came faster than I expected. The HOA had paid $48,000 for the security operation. The invoice described the service as a property access enforcement assignment. That phrase changed everything. The HOA was no longer simply claiming that I had violated a community rule. It had spent a substantial amount of community money to enforce access to property that the county records showed belonged to me. Michael reviewed the invoice and immediately noticed another detail. The security contract had been signed 2 days before Victoria sent me the first compliance notice. The timing was impossible to ignore. I asked whether that proved wrongdoing. Michael told me it proved the timeline, not intent. We needed the board records showing why the contract had been approved. I requested those next. While we waited, I went through every document I had collected. The more I compared the dates, the clearer the sequence became. First came the developer's revised access proposal. Then came the HOA committee discussion. Then came the security contract. Only afterward did the bird complaint appear. The order was almost the reverse of what Victoria had told me. She had presented the birds as the reason for the dispute, but the records suggested the property access issue came first. That discovery changed how I viewed every conversation we had already had. The next morning, Michael called with another document. It was a board meeting summary. One sentence referred to clearing the existing occupant before the transfer deadline. My name was not written, but there was no other occupant associated with the property in question. I asked Michael what we should do. He told me to stay calm and let the records speak. I agreed. I had no interest in turning this situation into a confrontation. I wanted the facts preserved exactly as they appeared. Then another surprise arrived. The security supervisor who had stood at my driveway the first day contacted Michael directly. He wanted to clarify that his company had been given paperwork representing that the HOA had authority to remove me from the property. He also said his team had been instructed not to proceed without confirmation of that authority. That explained why the guards had waited instead of forcing the issue. It also created a new problem for Victoria. If the HOA had paid $48,000 for an operation based on an unverified property claim, the board would eventually have to explain why. Michael told me there was one more document we needed, the original map used before the developer's revision. He believed it might show exactly when the boundary changed on paper. That evening I received a message from the county clerk. The original map had been located in the archived planning file. There was also a handwritten note attached to it. The note contained a date, a name, and a request for a revised drawing. For the first time, we were no longer asking why the map was different. We were about to learn who had asked for it. The handwritten note had one name at the top, and it was not the developer's. It belonged to a member of the HOA committee. Michael Brooks enlarged the scanned image and sent it to me before breakfast. The note requested a revised drawing before the access agreement could move forward. The date was 3 weeks before Victoria ever mentioned my property to me. That was the first document that connected the timeline directly. The HOA had known about the access proposal before it created the compliance dispute. I told Michael to keep everything organized and requested the complete committee file. While we waited, I received an unexpected call from the supervisor of the private security company. He introduced himself as Daniel Price and said he wanted to clarify what his team had been given before they arrived at my property. He explained that the HOA had provided a packet representing that it had authority to remove an occupant from a community-controlled parcel. His team had accepted the assignment based on that representation. After seeing my deed and hearing that there was no court order, Daniel had instructed his staff to avoid taking further action until the authority was verified. I thanked him for putting that in writing. Before he ended the call, he asked if my name was Michael Carter. I said yes. There was a pause. "Were you ever with the United States Army Special Forces?" he asked. I had not expected that question. I told him I had served years ago and had retired from military service. Daniel became quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I thought I recognized the name." I did not explain my rank. I did not need to. My military background had nothing to do with who owned the property, and I had no intention of using it as a threat. But Daniel asked whether I had been a commander. I answered honestly, "Yes. I was a Special Forces commander before I retired." The conversation ended a few minutes later. I put my phone down and returned to the documents. The reveal did not change the deed. It did not create an easement. It did not give me special authority over the HOA. What it did explain was why I had refused to panic when 18 people appeared at my gate. Years of command had taught me that the first reaction in a difficult situation should be verification, not emotion. I went back to the county file and found another important detail. The revised map had been submitted after the developer requested a faster approval schedule. The original survey was still on record, and nothing in the file showed that my property boundary had ever been legally changed. Michael called again with the committee records. One meeting entry said the board needed to resolve the occupant issue before closing. That sentence was enough to change the entire story. I was not being removed because of an HOA violation. I was being treated as an obstacle to a transaction. Then Michael found the security invoice. $48,000 had been approved for the assignment. He told me the next step was to determine exactly which board members authorized the payment, and whether they had verified the property records first. I looked toward my driveway, where 18 guards had stood only days earlier. The real question was no longer whether the HOA believed it had authority. The question was how far it had gone to make that belief look legitimate. The board records arrived the next morning, and the first page answered a question I had been carrying since the guards appeared at my driveway. The $48,000 security contract had been approved during an emergency HOA meeting, but the minutes showed that the board had not reviewed my deed or the county survey before authorizing the expense. Instead, they relied on the revised community map supplied with the developer's proposal. Michael Brooks highlighted that detail in the copy he sent me. "This is important," he wrote. "They did not verify ownership before acting." I read the sentence twice. It did not prove that every board member knew the map was inaccurate, but it proved something almost as important. The HOA had made a major decision without checking the official property records. I asked Michael what that meant for the 72-hour deadline. He said the developer could still attempt to proceed with its transaction, but the access issue was now documented, and any legitimate transfer involving my property would require a lawful property interest. I wanted that distinction kept clear. I did not want the story to become about my military background. I wanted it to remain about ownership, records, and authority. That afternoon, Michael and I met with a county records specialist who reviewed the original survey and the revised planning map. She confirmed that the original boundary had never been replaced by a new recorded survey. The newer drawing was a planning document, not a legal transfer of ownership. Then she pointed to a small notation on the developer's application. The access corridor was described as subject to property owner agreement. I looked at Michael. Either of us spoke for a moment. That phrase meant the developer knew it needed my permission. The HOA could support a proposal, but it could not manufacture that permission. The 18 guards suddenly looked less like an enforcement operation and more like an attempt to create pressure before the deadline. We still needed proof of who authorized the security contract, and why the board believed the property was under HOA control. Michael requested the meeting recordings and correspondence connected to the emergency vote. By evening, one message had arrived from the HOA secretary. It contained a short exchange between Victoria and a developer representative. The developer asked whether the occupant matter had been resolved. Victoria replied that the association was handling it and expected the property to be cleared before closing. There was no mention of birds. No mention of a rule violation. No mention of a safety concern. The focus was the property. That was the moment the entire dispute became clear to me. The bird complaint had been the visible reason, but the access corridor was the real objective. I called Michael and asked what we should do next. He said we needed to preserve every record and prepare for the county filing before the deadline expired. Then he added one sentence that changed the urgency completely. "Michael, the developer's closing date is tomorrow afternoon." I looked at the clock. We had less than 24 hours to make sure the official record told the same story we had finally uncovered. At 7:10 the next morning, Michael Brooks and I submitted the county filing with every document we had collected, including my deed, the certified survey, the original county map, the revised planning map, the security contract, and the HOA correspondence. I had spent years keeping records for my property, but I had never imagined that a folder of old documents would become the most important thing on my desk. The county clerk stamped our submission and gave us a receipt showing the filing had been accepted before the developer's scheduled closing that afternoon. That did not automatically stop the transaction, but it placed the property dispute into the official record. Michael explained that the next step was to request immediate review of the proposed access corridor and the HOA's claimed authority. While we waited, Victoria Reynolds called me. Her voice was much calmer than it had been at my driveway. She said the HOA wanted to resolve the matter without further escalation. I asked whether the board was withdrawing its removal notice. She avoided giving me a direct answer and instead said the developer was under pressure because of the closing deadline. That confirmed something we had already suspected. The deadline was not just an administrative date. Someone stood to lose a great deal if the access arrangement failed. I told Victoria that I was willing to discuss the property issue, but only through documented channels and with my attorney present. She agreed. An hour later, Michael received an email from the HOA's attorney. It contained a revised statement claiming that the association had never intended to take ownership of my property. Instead, the HOA claimed it had relied on the planning map in good faith. That explanation created a new problem for the board. If the HOA had never claimed ownership, why had it sent 18 private security guards to remove me? Michael asked the attorney that question in writing. The response did not come immediately. Meanwhile, the county records specialist called with an update. She had compared the original survey with the developer's revised drawing and confirmed that the access corridor crossed my private parcel. More importantly, the developer's application contained the words, "Subject to property owner agreement." My permission had never been obtained. The planned closing suddenly depended on an agreement that did not exist. Then another document appeared. It was a copy of the security company's instructions from the HOA. The first line described the assignment as clearing an existing occupant before the development deadline. There was no reference to an HOA rule violation. No reference to a bird complaint. No reference to community safety. The language was precise, and it changed the meaning of everything that had happened. I sent the document to Michael. He called me within minutes. "This is the connection," he said. "They were trying to clear the property before the developer's closing, not enforce a routine HOA rule." For the first time, we had a complete timeline from the original access proposal to the security contract and the removal notice. But there was still one question left. If the HOA knew the developer needed my agreement, why had they acted as though they could simply remove me instead? Before I could answer, Michael received a notice from the county. The review had been scheduled for that afternoon, and the developer had been invited to attend. The county review began at 2 in the afternoon, and for the first time, everyone involved had to look at the same documents. I sat beside Michael Brooks while Victoria Reynolds sat across the room with the HOA attorney. The developer's representative joined by video conference. Nobody mentioned the 18 guards at first. The county records specialist placed the original survey on the table, and then displayed the revised planning map beside it. The difference was immediately visible. The original survey placed the entire disputed strip inside my property. The revised planning map showed the strip as part of a proposed access corridor. The county specialist explained that the newer drawing was submitted for planning purposes and did not change the recorded ownership boundary. Then she pointed to the developer's own application. The access corridor was clearly marked as subject to property owner agreement. Michael asked whether any agreement from me appeared in the county file. The answer was no. There was no signed easement, no recorded transfer, and no consent from me. The developer's representative tried to explain that the access route had been considered part of a future development plan. The county specialist calmly replied that planning consideration did not create a property right. That sentence changed the room. Victoria's attorney then argued that the HOA had relied on the information supplied by the developer and believed it was acting within its authority. Michael asked one simple question. If the HOA believed it had authority, where is the recorded document that gives it control over this parcel? There was a long pause. The attorney referred to the community map. The county specialist corrected him. The map was not a recorded transfer document. It was a planning exhibit. That distinction was decisive. The county representative then reviewed the security contract. The document showed that the HOA had paid $48,000 for an assignment described as clearing the existing occupant before the development deadline. Victoria looked down at the table. The developer's representative asked whether the closing could still proceed. The county specialist said the proposed access route could not be treated as an established right across private property without the required legal interest. Michael turned to me and quietly said that the records had finally caught up with the story. Then the county representative made the most important statement of the afternoon. The official property boundary had never changed. My deed still controlled the parcel. The revised map had created an appearance, but it had not created ownership. The developer's closing was placed on hold pending resolution of the access issue. That did not mean the entire development was cancelled, but it meant the plan could not simply proceed across my property, as if I did not exist. Victoria finally asked whether I would consider granting access voluntarily. I told her I would review any lawful proposal with my attorney, but I would not agree to a property transfer under pressure. The meeting ended with the county requiring the parties to correct the planning record and provide documentation for any future access request. As we walked outside, Michael received one final message. The HOA board was scheduling an emergency meeting for the next morning. They intended to decide whether to withdraw the removal notice, explain the $48,000 security expense, and correct the community records. The same board that had sent 18 guards to my driveway now had to explain, in writing, why they had believed they could do it in the first place. The emergency HOA meeting began the next morning, and this time I walked in knowing the entire record was different from the story Victoria Reynolds had told me at my driveway. The board had spent $48,000 on private security, relied on an unverified planning map, and attempted to clear my property before a developer's closing deadline. Now every decision had to be explained in front of the board members and their attorney. Victoria opened the meeting by stating that the HOA had acted based on information it believed to be accurate. Michael Brooks immediately asked that the official county findings be entered into the meeting record. The county documents confirmed that my deed and certified survey remained valid, that the original property boundary had never been legally changed, and that the developer's proposed access corridor crossed private property without a recorded easement or signed agreement from me. The HOA attorney reviewed the documents and recommended that the removal notice be withdrawn. The board voted to do exactly that. The security contract was also reviewed, and the board agreed that the $48,000 expense required a separate financial review because the property ownership had never been verified before the contract was approved. Victoria did not argue. She simply looked down at the paperwork that had once seemed so convincing. The developer's representative then asked whether I would consider granting access in the future. Michael told him that any request would have to be made through the proper legal process, with clear terms and without pressure. I agreed. I had never wanted the development to fail. I had wanted my property rights respected. By the end of the meeting, the HOA records were ordered to be corrected so the community map would no longer suggest that my land belonged to the association. The developer's access proposal remained on hold until a lawful agreement could be reached. No one demanded that I leave. No one mentioned removing me again. The 18 guards were gone, and the driveway was quiet. As I drove home, I thought about the question Michael had asked me during that first phone call. Do they have a court order? They never had. They had a notice, a planning map, and confidence. What they did not have was legal authority over my property. The next morning, I stood at the edge of my land and looked toward the driveway where the security team had gathered days earlier. The property looked exactly as it always had. The boundary markers were still in place. The house was still mine. The land was still mine. And the records finally said what they had said all along. My past as a Special Forces commander had surprised the people who came to my property, but it was never what won the dispute. Discipline helped me stay calm. Experience helped me organize the facts. But the deed, the survey, the county records, and the lawful process did the real work. The HOA had tried to turn an assumption into authority, and the official record had quietly proved that it could not. I did not need 18 people to leave in embarrassment. I only needed the truth to remain on paper. In the end, that was enough.